Hey guys, what's up? Public back with another video, and today this is the second video of our kind of guide series for the launch of Shadowlands. In yesterday's video, we went over the talents, so if you want to check that out, the playlist is going to be linked in the description, and then every day over the next couple days will be another installment of this guide, so make sure you check that out if you want the full version. Now today, I really just want to talk about preparation, right? So what can you do outside of Raid, outside of Mythic Plus? What should you be aiming to be getting to maximize your Shadow Priest before you get to that content, right? So we're going to go over kind of stats, help you out with a little bit of gearing choices, conduits, legendaries, consumables, all that good stuff, okay? Let's get started. Okay, so first things first, let's go over stats real quick. So I know I've already kind of done a few videos on stats specifically. I do kind of want to mention that, you know, stats are much more complicated than I'm going to make them out right here, just because, you know, things will change greatly depending on, you know, the type of content that you're doing. Is it more single target? Is it more AoE? All that good stuff, right? At the end of the day, though, the kind of easiest way to think about it is how much intellect does it have? This is actually very nice. New with Shadowlands is that we actually love intellect. Intellect is our best stat. You need quite a lot of secondaries to make up for that, so this makes gearing more or less easy for most slots, except for the neck piece and your rings, because they don't have intellect. And then trinkets are also going to be a little fuzzy, right? Those depend on a lot of other factors, but generally speaking, taking the highest eye level piece of a slot is usually going to be the thing you want to do. Now, that being said, haste gives us a lot of great benefits, especially if you're kind of learning to play Shadow, or you're still kind of understanding how things work. Haste is basically our favorite thing to help kind of counteract that. And just in general, even if you're playing perfectly, haste does great damage. So what I like to tell people is, you know, shoot for the highest item level piece that has haste on it. Generally speaking, that's going to give you great results no matter what you're doing, whether it's like haste crit, haste mastery, or even haste versatility. Getting that haste is a pretty big jump. Now, after that, so let's say you get intellect, haste, and you're comparing other things. Crit and mastery are basically the next level things you want to look for. As far as that kind of second stat, so you'd go like intellect, haste, and then crit or mastery. Now, with that, you got to be a little careful about, again, what you're doing, what talents you're taking, because some of our talents do change up our kind of benefit we're getting from crits, specifically with Auspicious Spirits and Hungering Void. Both of these talents do put a little bit more emphasis on crit. Again, not a whole lot, but a little bit. So this is kind of one of those things where if you're in kind of a more multi-target situation, you're going to get more benefit out of crit. And then if you're in kind of like pure single target, this is where mastery really shines. Now again, there's caveats to both of those things, because mastery is also good in multi-target inside of void form. So if you're taking things like Surrender to Madness, you're getting lots of void form uptime, mastery can also be good there. Same thing with crit on the reverse, right? If you're taking Hungering Void and Auspicious Spirits, crit is also very nice in single target. So a lot of things kind of switch up, and for the most part, crit and mastery are going to be almost dead equal because of this. I would say critical strike is a bit more friendly to kind of mistakes or setting up. Mastery is a bit more like you get your damage inside of void form, like don't mess up void form, whereas crit is a little bit more forgiving in that respect, but not by much. And then really the last thing is versatility, right? Versatility is effectively just a worse version of our mastery. It's really not exciting. It's just a damage and damage taken change, so it's not something you want to aim for. But if it's there, you get the high level, it's fine, but not something we're exactly looking for specifically. So the other thing I do want to keep in mind here is we have diminishing returns on stats. So what that means is once you pass these thresholds, you actually get less percentage of a stat per point that you're getting into it. I know that might be a little complicated if you're kind of newer to the game, but basically what this means is for haste, critical strike, and versatility, once you get to 30% of that stat, they start to diminish return their value. So what that means is, let's say, for example, 100 haste equals 1%, or whatever it is. I don't know off the top of my head. It's going to take more rating to get that extra percent than it would have otherwise. So what this typically means is, and this is actually like a very crazy curve, which, you know, again, if you get to like 50% haste, it falls off even more. So you do want to be a little careful here, because what this means is you're effectively getting 10% less out of the stat points than you would have if it went into another stat. So usually you don't really need to think about this too much. I would say, you know, go for intellect and haste on your gear. If you're noticing that you're hitting that 30% point, I would consider simming your character, checking on like patchwork, cleave-ad, light movement stuff. You're probably better off swapping out some enchants or gems to mastery or crit, because again, since our stats and things are kind of close together, haste becoming 10% worse past 30% probably means Critter Mastery is going to push that one out. So just something to keep in mind there. It is very, very important to do that. Now, Mastery is the weird one. I know I didn't mention Mastery. Since they have a conversion rating for Mastery, it's actually not 30%. For us, it actually happens at 19%. Should be 15%, but because we have 4% baseline Mastery, becomes 19% is when that point happens for that. So 30% for Haste Crit Inverse, 19% DR for Mastery. These aren't targets you want to be hitting necessarily. It's just if you do hit them for any of these stats, keep in mind it's probably going to switch up some of the things that you want to do, mainly your enchants and your gems. All right, so that is stats. Let's move on to our conduits. All right, guys, let's talk about conduits. So I'm not going to go too into depth here on like the specific soul binds, because depending on your covenant that you've picked, this will change up a little bit of what you want to do here, because some soul binds get access to a second conduit slot faster than others. Almost all of us, unless you're Night Fae right now, only have a single potency conduit that we can put into our soul bind. So make sure you check the sims in the description for that, because it does change based on that. And again, if you were kind of curious about what covenant to pick, I did do a video on that as well. So you can check that out if you're kind of curious what covenant you should pick as a Shadow Priest. There are a lot of good answers, so I'll leave that to that video specifically. But the good news is our conduits actually do not change based on our covenant, exactly like the ones that we want. For the most part, it's going to stay the same, right? There are specific conduits that are only for that covenant that you're in that affect that covenant ability. However, across the board, these conduits are just straight up worse than most of the shadow specific ones that we have. Specifically, we have two that we really want to look at, which is Dissonant Echoes and Haunting Apparitions. So Dissonant Echoes, just baseline, gives Void Bolt more damage, which is just kind of crazy. It gives it quite a lot, 35%, I believe. And then it does get some extra scaling. You get some kind of chances to proc free Void Bolts outside of Void form, and then Void Bolt cooldown resets inside of Void form. That cooldown reset or the Void Bolt proc isn't actually the big bump of this conduit. It's just the amp on Void Bolt damage is why this thing is so good. So generally speaking, while you're doing progression, if you only have that one potency conduit slot, you want to be using Dissonant Echoes in there, especially for raiding. And especially when you're using Hungering Void. Now, that being said, Haunting Apparitions is our second best conduit in a raiding environment. Just works really, really well. It's simple. There's nothing to play around. Just damage amp on Shadowy Apparitions, which is great. Does make the value of AS a little bit better with our gearing and things like that, but nothing too crazy. I will say that, if you're looking at Mythic Plus specifically, or heavy AoE where you're not casting Void Bolt, obviously Dissonant Echoes takes a hit there if you're not casting it. We're talking about like 7 or more targets, you always stop casting Void Bolt. That cutoff is actually 6 or more without Hungering Void. So in those cases, you could swap your conduit to Haunting Apparitions for dungeons. Although, again, it may or may not be worth it, because Void Bolt's still going to be great on things like Prideful and those boss mobs. So swapping it out, kind of depends on what you're doing. I know me personally, I've been keeping Dissonant Echoes even for Mythic Plus. Pretty good value for the most part, especially on those single target fights, which I do like. So I think those are pretty much all you really need to keep in mind with our conduits. Now, the great thing is, so if you have Dissonant Echoes as your top slot, Haunting Apparitions is your second for raid, flip those for Mythic Plus. That being said, Dissonant Echoes especially actually doesn't have much scaling in it whatsoever. The kind of raw Void Bolt damage amp does not get better with eye level. So don't fret too much about getting conduits at high eye level. The damage increase from going from like 187 to 200 or even like to 300 eye level is very, very tiny. It's almost unnoticeable for Dissonant Echoes. You do get a bit more for Haunting Apparitions scaling, although again, the main value of these conduits is getting that base one. Don't worry too much about having it at different ranks. That's really only going to be a matter of choice between, am I going to slot Haunting Apparitions versus Dissonant Echo for this kind of fight? So that's really all I have to keep in mind. The other conduits, for the most part, are not something you really ever want to slot in, unfortunately. They're just not that good, especially the Covenant-specific ones. I will say, I'll put a caveat in here, because Rabid Shadows could be good at some point inside of Mythic Plus, especially if you're taking Mindbender. But I think, again, that's kind of like an overall Mythic Plus dungeon scenario versus I want to optimize for single target, which is a hard thing to choose between. And again, I don't think it's worth, fully like replacing a conduit every time you want to change content. So I think you guys are totally fine rocking Distant Echoes or Haunting Apparitions for that stuff, okay? Now, again, sim charts are in the description if you want to check those out, but that is your Conduits as a Shadow Priest. All right, let's talk about Legendaries real quick. This one's actually pretty easy. Our Legendaries actually are not that good, so don't be looking for the same kind of increase that you would see on like Balance Spirits with their awesome Legendary or others. Ours are generally not that impactful, which is going to lead to some interesting decisions that in the end don't really matter that much, but again, kind of take everything with a grain of salt. So for the most part, I would suggest everyone craft Eternal Call of the Void as a Shadow Priest. It's generally going to be our go-to legendary that's effective in basically every form of content. The only caveat there is it does, you have to be able to proc it. The proc rate on that sucker does get better with haste, so if you have really low gear and like 5% haste, it's going to feel terrible. Just note that it does get better with more gear, which is good. The only problem is, again, the proc rate is RPPM, which, means you could get a lot of procs on one fight and no procs the next fight, depending on how much you're casting Mind Flay. So that is kind of frustrating for some players for sure. Just know it does get a little bit better. And again, this is basically our best in slot for rating and Mythic Plus for that reason. But again, your usage will vary here depending on your haste and how much you're actually casting these spells. So since it is RPPM, the one thing you want to keep in mind with Eternal Call of the Void is that just because you're casting more Mind Flays or Mind Seers doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be getting more procs. Theoretically, you're just going to get one every, it's a 1.3 RPPM. So like casting more should not give you more procs, but if you haven't been casting for a minute, chances are the next time you cast Mind Flay, you're probably going to get a proc. So there is some gaming you can do with it. Just know that it's not that much of a direct science of every tick can proc. It is a bit more complex than that. Now, past that, there are basically two other legendaries that you can consider crafting depending on what you're doing, which is Twins of the Sun Priestess legendary, which is the power infusion legendary, as a lot of us call it. And there's also Talbodar's Stratagem. So I think, personally, I would go with Twins as like that second thing that you would craft depending on what you're doing. Twins is going to be great, and again, this is going to be hard for some people. It's not better for you specifically. This is a group-wide increase, right? So if you don't know what Twins does, you cast Power Infusion on someone else, that means you also get it. Effectively, the damage of this that it's creating is giving someone else PI. So the value of the legendary greatly depends on lots of different factors. Mainly, who are you giving PI to? How good of a player are they? How good is their class with haste scaling? Are you using it at the correct time, right? So there are a lot of different things you want to think about here. So like, for example, if you use it based on when you want PI, that might not be great for classes that have like a 3-minute cooldown. But if they have a 2-minute cooldown that it syncs up when you want to use it, that could be really solid. So again, mileage is going to vary pretty hard here. But on certain fights with like you're getting terrible things with Eternal Call of the Void, or you want something with more consistency, Twins of the Sun Priestess is definitely a good thing to slot in there. Now, that being said, in Mythic Plus, I think it's actually easier to get these lineups a bit more frequently, but this will greatly depend on who you're going to play with, right? So the value of Power Infusion for a Destruction Warlock versus a Fire Mage versus Unholy Death Knight or Marksman Hunter varies widely. So definitely change up whether or not you want to use this based on the people that you run Mythic Plus with, or how good your raid is, or things like that. I know me personally, I've been running with an Unholy Death Knight and a Marksmanship Hunter for a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, and I get a reasonable amount of value for my group giving the Unholy Death Knight or the Marksman Hunter PI. It's just about syncing up with, their cooldowns like Army of the Dead or True Shot, whatever else it is. So a bit more finesse to use Twins, but can actually produce some good results, which is why I suggest crafting it second. Now, the kind of wild card that I do want to throw in here is Talbodar's Stratagem. Some of you may have already crafted this. It does actually sim pretty well if you're just doing Patrick single target sims. Unfortunately, in like a real world environment or, in multi-target scenarios, you're getting less and less value out of this, which is why we suggested not to craft it first. That being said, you can get pretty good results out of this on pure single target, right? That is something that's going to do well. It doesn't have the most scaling in the world, but it's something. It's kind of awkward to play around. It really doesn't change your rotation whatsoever, so don't hold your Mind Blast necessarily for Devouring Plagues. Usually that's not worth it to do at all. Just something you want to keep in mind. Again, it's not going to be the best on most fights, just because the only time where you're going to have a target you're funneling in is typically just those single target encounters like Shriekwing or things like that. But again, mileage is going to vary. It's not going to be that impactful either way. The best part about Talbot Stratagem is that you can craft it on the leg slot, which has a lot of stats on it, which makes it really good, especially if your legs aren't that great. Which, keep that in mind. That is something that will change based on these items if you want to craft it on one slot versus the other, because it really just depends on, what do you have in there already. And as we kind of wrap up with the kind of legendary discussion, I do want to kind of mention briefly with the slots. A lot of people are crafting Eternal Call to the Void on the wrist slot. From like a pure overall best in slot perspective, there aren't good like haste wrists in the game, so a lot of folks, including myself, did that. Gloves are also a really great option, especially if you don't get gloves very early on, but there are a few great glove pieces in the game, so less good there. Twins of the Sun Priestess, kind of the same thing. There aren't, we actually have more options here, so it matters a bit less. It's either head or shoulders. Personally, I'm going to go with the helm because there are some pretty good shoulders at the end of the raid, but if you want this earlier on, you could go shoulders if you have really bad shoulders, so keep that in mind. And then Talbot Stratagem, generally speaking, you always want to craft this on the leg slot. There is a good chest in the raid, so don't worry too much about that. Or I think it's belt, actually. So again, it doesn't matter too much, but make sure you can always sim yourself to figure out what you want to use with your current gear. If you want what's the best item to craft with full best in slot, the sims in the description have you covered there, so you can take a look at that. And then quickly, if you do care about it, if you're doing like legendary analysis for like open world content, doesn't really matter. I wouldn't craft something specifically for that. If you are looking to have some more fun in Torghast, though, you could craft the Phantasm legendary. I forget what it's called. It's like the Phantasmal Lure, I think. Our legendary options in Torghast are pretty limited, but you can always do that if you'd like. But that is our legendaries as a Shadow Priest. Hopefully that helps. Let's move on to consumables. Okay, the last thing you want to do to get your Shadow Priest ready for raiding, Mythic Plus, whatever content you're doing from PvE perspective, is all of your consumables. So there's a lot of things that go along with this, so we'll kind of go through things real quick. So first things first, your gems, if you have any slots on your gear or if you've bought any sockets, generally speaking, you want to put a haste gem in here. I did mention before in the stats section of the video, this might be something you swap to crit or mastery later on once you get above 30% haste. But generally speaking, you just want to put haste in here. It just makes sense. Now, you could actually slot in a Leviathan's Eye of Intellect from BFA. This is an old BFA gem that gives us intellect. The sims that I've done pretty much showed these guys are at dead even with maybe a leaning towards the int gem. So depending on prices, you could slot one of these in one of your slots, but for most things, I don't think it's that worth it. If they're that much expensive, you're not going to really notice the difference either way, so take that for what it is. Moving on to other consumables, your potion here. This is actually it is somewhat debatable about what potion you want to use. I would suggest most people use the potion of Spectral Intellect. It just gives you intellect for 25 seconds, which is great for kind of overall consistent damage to all things that you're fighting, generally speaking. Now, there is another potion called Potion of Phantom Fire that you will notice does sim pretty well if you do test it out. The thing is, though, this is a RPPM proc effect that just kind of randomly spits out damage at the targets you're fighting, which may or may not be a good thing depending on what you're doing. So, for example, when it was bolstering week, I didn't like running with this. It was kind of just random damage rather than the focused damage of the intellect potion. So that's why I've kind of swapped over to using the int pot more often than not. It's just more consistent, but, use whatever you think is best for what you're doing. Flask is pretty easy. You're going to want the Spectral Flask of Power. The flask is the same for everyone, so no choice here. Just make sure you use that guy. Moving on to our food, we do want to be using the Feast. It is specifically the Feast of Gluttonous Hedonism. I'm probably saying that wrong, but whatever the big feast is, that's what you want to use. There is actually a smaller version of this feast as well that is basically equal to running the secondary stat food. It's very, very close. If you are just doing like single open world content or Torghast and don't want to blow up on a feast, you can use the kind of haste crit food as you see fit. The haste food is called Tenebrous Crown Roast Aspic. That's just generally what I use inside of Mythic Plus if we're not feasting or things like that. Other things you want to make sure you have is your weapon oil, which is Shadow Core oil. This guy is essential. It's very cheap to make, just a small damage increase, like 1.5%, something like that. Just note that if you are using Potion of Phantom Fire, it is a must that you have Shadow Core oil on your weapon. It does buff that potion a little bit there. Moving on, we have our Augment Rune as well. Very small difference to add these. There is an Augment Rune, just kind of making you guys aware of that, which is the Veiled Augment Rune. Just gives you a small boost to your main stat, which is fine. And then last but certainly least, actually, is the armor kit. So you can buy an armor kit to apply on your chest, which gives you like, I don't know, like 30 health or 300 health or something like that. It's just giving you some small amounts of stamina. On my server, these kind of go for a bit too much gold than I'm usually willing to spend on consumables, considering how little of an impact it is. But just note, if your raid is kind of struggling to live through a mechanic, maybe that little bit of extra stamina could help you out. But there you go. It's called the Heavily Desolate Armor Kit if you want that. So there you go. Now, moving on real quick to enchants. So this thing is pretty straightforward. You can enchant several of your slots now in Shadowlands. They've added several new enchants. Not all of them increase your damage, though. So I think for us, it's the gloves are kind of like a superfluous enchant. I think it's just like a Hearthstone or Gathering, something like that. Don't worry too much about it. But moving on to the ones that we do care about. So our chest enchant, which is Eternal Insight, which just gives us some main stat and then a kind of random proc from our chest. You can also go with the full 30 primary stat option here. A bit more consistent of an option, but Sims will generally lean towards Eternal Insight. The proc is somewhat okay, so there you go. Cloak here, you have some options here. They're all just going to give you stamina plus a tertiary stat, which is either speed, avoidance, or leech, or you can actually just get more stamina, I believe. Personally, I would either go with the avoidance option or the speed option. The avoidance one's going to be great for fights like Sludge Fist or others where avoidance works really well for that kind of group ticking damage. Whereas the speed could be really nice if you're, want to move to something faster. That can sometimes actually be a DPS increase. So I'd use either one of those. Generally speaking, you'll get good use out of both. For your bracers, you want to be using Eternal Intellect. Nice little 15 bump on your wrists. This will be able to be applied on the Legendary wrists if you choose to craft those, so keep that in mind. Your rings here, as I mentioned before, you pretty much want to use haste enchants on your rings, although again, once you hit that kind of 30% DR value, you can start swapping these out for crit or mastery as you see fit. And then for your weapon enchant, I would say if you only have a single good weapon, I would use Celestial Guidance. Otherwise, you can put on Sinful. There's a Sinful one that you can use for pure single target. But generally speaking, Celestial Guidance is going to be the one for kind of overall damage increase on AoE. It's decent in single target. It will be a little bit behind the Sinful one, but again, that kind of depends on what you're doing. If you only want to optimize for single target, could go for that, but as soon as you start having multi-targets, the Sinful buff could be going on something you don't want it to, which is kind of frustrating more than anything, so I would suggest using Celestial Guidance. Now, keep in mind, you can actually swap weapons in Mythic Plus now. So if you do actually get like 2 good weapons, maybe save the second one with just a different enchant on it, and you could actually swap that on for bosses and then use Celestial Guidance for trash. That is something you could do if you really want. Or maybe swap it around for like Sludge Fist or Shriekwing where it's only a single target. But again, depends on how try hard you want to go. Totally up to you on whether or not you want to do that. Alright guys, that is it for consumables, and that's all I have for preparing you as a Shadow Priest going into the next bit of content. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. We have the other videos in the series coming out soon. Every day for the next couple days we'll have more coming out. If you're watching this further in the future, just check the playlist linked in the description below for the rest of these guides. But that is it for this video. Big thanks to the patrons that are supporting me and all these crazy guides. I know it's been a little slow rolling with all these videos out there, but hopefully you're enjoying this content. Could not have been possible without the level of people supporting me and everyone watching this video. So thank you so much, guys. We'll see you in the next one.